Friction, one of the most important aspects of our day-to-day life. Without friction, nothing is possible in this world. So physics comes into play even in our daily lives. Combing of our hair, brushing our teeth, polishing our shoes, washing our clothes, washing our utensils, walking on the road, fixing a nail on the wall are all possible because of friction. Friction is the opposite force between two surfaces when they are in contact with each other. A simple example of friction is on a winter day we feel cold, and when we try to rub our hands against each other to get a feeling of warmth. So what happens is here friction comes into play. The two hands move opposite to each other. So the opposite force between these two hands, the surface of the two hands produces heat because of friction. So if both the hands move in same direction, there is no friction between the two palms of our hand. So since one hand is moving opposite to the other, that creates heat, and that is what is known as friction. When we walk on the road, we tend to push the road backwards and then we move forward. That is friction. When vehicles move on the road, the tires move forward and the tires push the road backwards. That is an example of friction. When we light a matchstick, we tend to give opposite force between the matchstick and the box, because of which the matchstick catches fire. So opposite force between the matchstick and the box is friction. There are three types of friction: static friction, sliding friction, rolling friction. From the word static, we understand that when one object is not moving and placed over other object, that is an example of static friction. And this is highest. I'll explain you why this friction is highest. It is more among the three. Sliding friction. You must have all gone to a park and used the slide, where you climb some steps and slide down. That is an example of sliding friction. When we push a box or pull a box, the box slides on the ground, on the floor. This is an example of sliding friction. Less force is required in sliding friction. And the last one is rolling friction. When you take a ball and roll on the floor, that is an example of rolling friction. The rolling of tires on the road is an example of rolling friction. Static friction is highest because we have to overcome the inertia of rest to move this object. So that is why static friction is highest, and the least is rolling friction. It is because of friction between the object and the surface that objects tend to stop after moving for some time. In case if there was no friction, then objects would never stop, they would continue to move. But because of this friction, the objects, they stop. And friction happens because of interlocking. Remember this word interlocking, because there are irregularities on the surface. So if this is one surface, and if I take a ball and roll over this surface, the ball tends to stop here. It is because the surface of the ball is also having irregularities. So the irregularities of the surface of the ball and the irregularities on the surface of the floor lock against each other. That is why the ball tends to stop. That is known as interlocking. We have a very important word called drag. Sometimes when it is a windy day, we tend to be pushed backwards. When we open the umbrella on a windy day, and as well as when there is rainfall accompanied by wind, we are pushed backwards. This pushing of backwards by the wind is also a type of friction. It is known as drag. This drag is defined as the frictional force exerted by fluids. By fluids, here it may be air or water. It is very difficult to walk on a watery surface because the water also tends to push us backwards. So that pushing of backwards by air or water is known as drag. That is why you must have seen the design of aeroplanes. The design of aeroplanes is very streamlined. They are having an aerodynamic design. That means the front part of this aeroplane is always pointed. The front part of a boat is always pointed. This is called streamline shape. Why this streamline shape is necessary? Because if there is a flat surface, there will be more friction from the air or from the water, and the objects will be pushed backwards. So there will be loss of fuel. So therefore, objects moving in fluids must have special shapes. Those special shapes are known as streamline shapes. So aeroplanes or ships or boats are always pointed at the front part to overcome the friction exerted by air or water, to overcome the drag, in other words. So the streamline objects move faster in air as well as in water. Let us see 3 simple activities related to friction. Friction, as we know, it is the opposing force between 2 areas which are in contact with one another. For this activity, I have simple objects placed on the table: a ball, a matchbox, and a mobile phone. The first type of friction is experienced by all 3 objects, that is static friction. When these 3 objects are placed on the table, they are not moving at all. However, when they are in contact with the table, there is an opposite force between these 3 objects and the table. That opposite force is friction, and since these 3 objects are not moving, there is static friction experienced by these objects. The second type of friction is sliding friction. When this matchbox moves on the table, it slides over the table. This is an example of sliding friction. When this mobile phone is moved on the table, it experiences sliding friction. Now, the thing to be noticed here is that when this mobile moves in this direction, there is an opposite force experienced by this mobile. That opposite force is friction. So when this mobile moves in this direction, there is an opposite force in this direction. So that opposing force is friction. And this in particular is sliding friction. The third type is when one object rolls over the other. The rolling of this ball on the table is an example of rolling friction, and static friction is highest. It is very easy to roll a ball. because rolling friction experiences the minimum friction, whereas static friction experiences the highest friction, because it has to overcome the inertia of rest. Before moving, it has to overcome the inertia of rest and then start moving. That is why static friction is highest and rolling friction is the least in terms of the three different types of friction. Now the question is, how do friction comes into play? Friction happens because there is interlocking between the two objects. The simple meaning of interlocking is, if I do this activity, it is very difficult for me to pull the pages of this book from one another. That means there is interlocking between one page and the other page of the book. So that is why it is very difficult for me to pull this book out from the other book. This is the definition of interlocking. Because you see, the surfaces are always irregular. So it is these irregularities which causes friction. That means if I slide this mobile, it stops in this position because of interlocking between this mobile and the surface of the table. Even if I move this ball comes and stops somewhere. It is because of the interlocking between the two surfaces, the ball and the table. So friction takes place because of interlocking between two surfaces in contact with each other. Let us take two cases and we'll learn from these two cases whether friction increases or is reduced. The first case, spreading soap water on floor. And the second case, spreading of sand and on floor. When we spread soap water on floor, the friction is reduced because the irregularities are covered by soap water. And hence what happens, if a person wearing shoes steps on this floor, he tends to slip and fall down because friction is very much reduced between his slippers or shoes and the floor, because the irregularities are covered and the floor becomes slippery. Hence the friction is reduced. In the other case, if we spread sand on floor, the sand increases the irregularities on the floor, and because of this, if a person walks on the floor, friction is increased between the sole of his shoes or slippers and the floor. More irregularities, more friction. Less irregularities, less friction. That is why you must have seen on a muddy surface or a slippery surface, when it is very difficult for a car to move on a rainy day, people spread sand so that the tires of the vehicles, they overcome the friction and are removed from the slippery area. That is why, children, the shoes, the slippers, the tires are provided with irregularities. The soles of shoes and slippers are provided with irregularities to have a better grip on the ground. the pens are provided with a grip. The handle of badminton, the handle of cricket bat, the handle of bicycles, the handle of bikes are provided with irregularities so that we have a better grip while we hold them and they don't tend to slip. Therefore, friction provides a better grip. The sportsmen wearing shoes have different design shoes. Their shoes are provided with spikes so that they don't tend to slip and fall down while running. So these spikes provide a better grip on the ground between the shoes and the ground, and there is no slipping and falling down. Therefore, friction is here where it comes into action. Wherever friction is not required, we can reduce the friction. Say for example, this handle of the lock has some rust here, because of which it does not enter inside the lock easily. So, to reduce the friction, what we can do is, we can apply little bit of oil here. The moment we apply oil here, the handle of the lock becomes slippery and the friction is reduced. So we can easily put the lock and fix it with a key. It becomes easy. So we have reduced friction between this handle of the lock with this lock. And you must have also seen, when people play carom board, they spread powder on the carom board. It helps in reducing friction between the dice and the carom board, and the dice to move easily on the carom board, on the surface of the carom board. However, friction is required sometimes. You must have seen, when people go for weightlifting, they apply powder on their hand or sand on their hand and then hold the handle of the weightlifting instrument so that it provides a better grip. Therefore, friction is necessary and friction is also an evil. So wherever friction is necessary, things or objects are made accordingly, like the soles of shoes, the tires, the handles having grips. The sports person shoes are always provided with spikes to increase better grip on the ground so that they can run very fast. The shoes of football players are always having small spikes to improve or allow better grip on the ground while running. This is where friction comes into play. However, in automobiles, they use mobile, they use grease so that the tires can move easily. There is no friction in the gear while shifting of the gear. The mobile, the oil, the grease reduces the friction in the gearbox, and the automobiles, the vehicles, they move very, very fast. Sometimes when your mother uses the sieving machine, she applies oil on some parts of the sieving machine, especially the wheel of the sieving machine, so that the wheel of the sieving machine moves fast. So oil, grease, mobile, they reduce the friction. Whereas in other objects where friction is required, where we need to hold the objects properly, a grip is provided, like in case of this pen.